and the people and the plants, sort of the places on in the Oregon Coast Range, starts with some time I spent as an intern at the Tribal Historic Preservation Office with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. So I just want to raise my hand to the folks at the Grand Ronde TIPO for the work they've done to sort of put me on this path and be there to answer stupid questions every time I have them. I really appreciate that. And I just want to give a quick shout out to some work that I think that is really important that they're doing on understanding, the history of people in the land through tribal cultural landscapes, and working on some decolonizing maps and decolonial and anti-colonial mapping projects. There's a really good story in November that OPB put out with some interview work with some folks in the culture department there. So next time you're post-pandemic, find yourself at the Cedar Plank Buffet, maybe just head up the road to Chichalu and check out some of the, I think, really interesting stuff that's usually going on at the museum there. So that's, a little bit of how I came to be interested in the Oregon Coast Range, and then the plants and people of Oregon in general. That was at a time when I was at Oregon State University working on my MA thesis, which ended up, like every graduate project, something very different than what I had envisioned at the outset. I ended up looking at the way in which camas is distributed across the landscape throughout the state of Oregon, and finding some numerical evidence that beyond what you can explain of its geographic distribution with biophysical habitat measures like climate and topography, beyond that, there was explanatory value in looking for cultural centrality like homeland and hinterland, or the distance to a known earth oven for processing it into food. Those geographic variables gave more to the model than they took away in terms of parsimony. And so the signature of the relationship between camas and humans is literally written onto the landscape of the entire state. And that opened the door for me to a broader interest in the botanical dimensions of cultural landscapes, which took me to Dartmouth, where in another series of funny coincidences in graduate research, I ended up studying meadows. And I think that meadows are, a fascinating place that I want to share a little bit of their magic with you tonight. The Northwest, there's been a lot of energy, you've probably noticed, devoted to examining and understanding more about late Cyril forests, old growth forests, and one, crystallizing document for that and locus of action would be the Northwest Forest Plan. And, I've heard over the years from a few folks that there are other ecosystems in the Oregon Coast Range that are worth considering. Many folks in the Lower Nehalem Watershed probably think a lot about lakes and rivers, estuaries, dunes, the rocky intertidal. These are not late Cyril forest, and there's increasing study on early Cyril forest. I guess I should back up and say, when I talk about late Cyril, early Cyril, those are things that are thought to be in a series, on a successional trajectory. So if you have a disturbance like a fire or a landslide, then some plants will establish, maybe some short herbaceous plants, and then that gives way to shrubs, and that gives way to trees, which give way then to shade tolerant trees that can grow under the overstory and so forth. And so that process of succession, that ecological process of succession, you can think of as a train going from one station to another. But what about places that are apparently on a different successional trajectory? They missed that train. They don't turn into forests. Especially, what about small places that are surrounded by forests? So tonight, I want to invite you to focus a bit on meadows, small places surrounded by forest, which are not themselves forest, and take this little journey with me through some of them. I hope you can see my screen. I'm going to proceed as if you can. I've titled this talk Past and Present of Meadows Up in the Coast Range, and I took this photo I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. I think it's from the top of Mount Nebo. And I think if I were to pan to the right a little bit, wouldn't be able to see Nehalem, but you'd be able to see past Tillamook in that direction. So these meadows in Coast Range forests, I want to advocate for them as an intersection of big ideas. What are some of those big ideas? Let's get abstract for a second. You're probably familiar with the concept of a food chain, maybe even a food web. And ecologists have spilled so much ink, I guess now it's digital, they've spilled so many pixels and alphabetical characters on weighing the evidence for bottom-up versus top-down control. And I mean that within the metaphor of a food chain. And control is what part of an ecosystem influences other parts of that ecosystem. So a bottom-up control could be, say, there's a lot of grass in one place, which is edible by an herbivore, and then the herbivore's population increases because there's so much grass available. That would be bottom-up influence. The availability of a resource controls the population of its consumer. A top-down control could be that there's a carnivore eating that herbivore and then reducing its population. So that would be control from the top down through the food chain. And we'll talk a lot about how both of those controls are active in meadows. I would like to link the meadows in the Oregon Coast Range to similar meadows around the world. There was a great, I thought, article put out a few years ago formalizing temperate montane meadows as a globally recognizable ecosystem. Let's read that name backward. A meadow, right, is a graminoid dominated. So graminoids are grasses and grass-like plants, such as sedges and rushes. And that's the majority of the ecological community. In a montane setting, so mountainous, at temperate latitudes, that's between the tropics and the boreal and polar regions. So at these middle latitudes in the mountains, dominated by grasses, usually forest biomes. We'll talk more about biomes, but it's these little emerald gems of grassland within the, I've heard it described as rugged and scenic in the job ads for field technicians out in the Oregon Coast Range, rainforest. And this theoretical lens has now been applied to the Oregon Coast Range, the Appalachian grassy balds, Polynesias in the Carpathians, and a few other places. So they're in good company, these little meadows in the Coast Range. The grassland woodland mosaic dynamics of the world have fascinated ecologists for as long as they've been calling themselves ecologists, maybe longer. A quick history of the term: 1791. I don't even know who was president then, but it was pretty early. Carolus Linnaeus published an idea that mountaintops look different from the rest of the mountains because they're floating over the biblical flood. This was the first salvo in the theoretical discussion of grassland woodland mosaics. We fast forward a little bit to 1807, Alexander von Humboldt, after whom many things such as the Humboldt Bay in California were named, expanded that theory to include elevational gradients. So you've got warm, wet, lush environments at the bottom of a hill, and a gradient up to cold, relatively dry, sparse environments at the top of the hill. We go a century to 1903. A guy named Livingston was talking about tension zones and what determines the boundary between the Great Plains and the eastern woodlands and the boreal forest. And then in the mid-20th century, we get to folks like Holdridge and Whitaker making biome models. And you've probably encountered the word biome. And by the 21st century, a South African researcher named Bond decided the best word to summarize, after more than 2 centuries of study in ecology, the best word for our understanding of grassland woodland mosaics was a conundrum. You know, we aren't to the bottom of it yet. And then one idea that has been gaining some interesting traction is the climate herbivore hypothesis. All of those things I just described, to draw on a previous concept from up on the top of your screen, those are all bottom-up controls. The climate determines the vegetation. The climate herbivore hypothesis says that was the case in the Pleistocene at the end of the last ice age. But since then, large herbivores have been acting like enormous lawnmowers, wandering through grassy balds in the Appalachians and so forth. And these articles specifically cite the Oregon Coast Range as one of the areas where this is likely, or at least plausible, and keeping them open at least until people start removing them through things like exclosures or replacing them with other taxa for grazing and that kind of thing. These woodlands are all, or these grasslands in woodland are also examples of small natural features, which have been put forward in the literature recently as basically keystone ecosystems. They are underrepresented in terms of the area they occupy in a landscape, but they contribute disproportionately greatly to the biodiversity and the ecological functioning of that landscape. That could range anywhere from a seamount reef, so a coral reef growing in the middle of the ocean on top of an underwater volcano or mountain, all the way through a standing snag in the forest that's home to a lot of birds and bugs and things. Small natural features, in my opinion, include these meadows in the Oregon Coast Range, but they are experiencing an existential threat because it's no longer a grassland if trees or shrubs grow in it, and woody encroachment, I'll show you some pictures in a second, is a globally prevalent and globally accelerating phenomenon, which has folks worried a little bit from an ecological perspective. And then meadows they're an interesting place to think about the mismatch between large-scale theory, simple is seductive. You want to think about how the world works, it's a lot easier to ask an answerable question if it's a simple question based on an elegant theory. But the world isn't always that simple, and things that work at the biome level in the history of grassland woodland dynamics, we're looking at those large scale drivers mostly. They may not still be true at the local level. And all of these big ideas intersect in the meadows and coast range forests. Let's explore them. Real quickly, remember I said I'd tell you a little bit more about woody plant encroachment. That URL at the bottom, LTERnet, that's the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. A lot of sites across the US, a couple sites across the world. And that authority states that woody plant encroachment into grasslands is one of the most prevalent contemporary, as in it's happening now, land cover changes. Where is it happening? Well, it's happening in Alaska and the Great Basin and the Great Plains. It's also happening south of the border in Argentina, all across the Arctic, in the Mediterranean, South Africa, way up in the Himalayas, and in the land down under. Woody plants are encroaching into grasslands, and no one knows exactly why, because when they push harder on that ecological trend to see what's under it, they find different things in different places. And so asking those questions in more places will help us understand the global phenomenon overall, hopefully. What does it look like? Up in Alaska, it looked like this from 1950 to 2008. You can see how there's an increase in the cover and the abundance of woody plants. Head south to British Columbia, it looks like the trees have been moving into Chittenden Meadow. And then we skip right past the Nehalem, we go to Mount Hebo, Oregon. Some of you on the call might have been alive in 1953, and you would have been able to walk a lot of places on Mount Hebo, look in a lot of directions unencumbered by trees. But after the Cold War, in this case, it's confounded in part because there was a large military installation on top of Mount Hebo, and I'm sure they had lawnmowers, which was active in 53, but not active in 94. And so that's one of the pieces of the story in this particular instance of encroachment, but there's still a lot of trees in the 90s that weren't there in the 50s. Mount Hebo is an interesting place because it is one of 5 sites. We'll back up for just a second. It says Zoll 2009 at the bottom of this screen. I drew this figure out of this paper by Harold Zoll. I had a chance to hike Mary's Peak with him once, and it was really enriching. I think he's a smart guy. I think he's teaching down at Humboldt now. And so he published a paper on 5 meadows with those colored in triangles there. MH up at the top is Mount Hebo, and MP there is Mary's Peak. It's the highest point in the Coast Range. Went up it a few times when I was in school in Corvallis. So there's one paper on the ecology of meadows in the Oregon Coast Range. Here's another, which was published a little while ago, and focuses exactly on Mary's Peak, only on Mary's Peak. And that's it. Up until I started this research project, let's say 5-6 years ago, these were the only 2 papers in the scholarly literature examining the ecological dynamics of meadows in the Oregon Coast Range. To give you a sense of scale, let's look at a color version of the figure on the left here. There are all of the EPA level, I think, 4 ecoregions in the state of Oregon. And if we focus up on those blue ones to the west, this is the Oregon Coast Range, and the Nehalem Watershed's located sort of in that northern lobe north of Tillamook, right? Just down the way, I've got information coming at you from 5 meadows on Siuslaw National Forest, kind of ringed around Mount Hebo. And I want to point out that the places that I'm talking to you about tonight, they're not on the summits. We know some things about summit balds, such as their exposure and their shallow soil and their more extreme climatic conditions, which aren't usually true about mid-slope, downslope locations on the landscape. And these are also not in the bottom of the drainages. These are not swamps and marshes and fens and things. These are just weird little grasslands that when you're hiking through the woods and burst out of the woods into a meadow, in my experience, it inspires you to pause and wonder, what is this doing here? Hopefully, by the end of this talk, if you have that experience, you'll have a few more tools in your box to ask that question in a productive way. So let's start. I titled this talk Past and Present of these little meadows. So let's start with the past. Simple question, how old are these small meadows which we find studding the Coast Range forests? Well, one way to answer that could be satellite imagery, right? Large coverage, the satellites just keep orbiting around the Earth and taking pictures, but quote one of my advisors, that's not the right answer here, because satellites have only been up for a few decades and we've only gotten useful data, and toward the end of that for this kind of question, especially data small enough to pick up a meadow. I mean, these things are approximately 1 hectare. They're not very large at all. Kind of the size of some yards I've seen even in student housing in Corvallis. So that's off the table for a way to investigate how old are these meadows. What's another way to investigate it? Maybe aerial photos. Well, first of all, Dr. Zoll already did that, but second of all, the first aerial photos of the Coast Range were taken in the 1940s, which only gets us back so far, hardly more than easy to find living memory. So let's keep looking for a line of evidence to ask this question. How about the earliest maps we can find? This is a GLO map from the late 1800s. I don't know if you've read about Chaining Oregon. It's a fascinating read if you like reading the sordid history of cadastral survey in the Pacific Northwest. And it's kind of a deep biographic look at how these maps were made. Anyway, I don't get a commission if you buy the book, but I think you'll enjoy it. But unfortunately, if it was on one of the specific chaining survey routes, there'll be a little bit of information about it, but it's hard to revisit a place time over time for a long period of time with terminology that's helpful for us. So where to look next? Well, there's a field of palynology, which was pioneered in large part by one of Aldo Leopold's children, Estella, who I had the pleasure of catching lunch with up in Seattle and talking about the history of paleoecological proxies for ecosystems in the past. And pollen is a wonderful line of evidence for asking these kind of questions, but the word small, and remember I was talking about scalar mismatch earlier, makes this also a sort of a dead end for investigating this question, because pollen is built, it's optimized to go the distance, right? And so you tend to get pollen deposited with great temporal accuracy in layers of sediment, like in a sea or a lake bed. And when you drill the sediment core, you can say all these things were growing in like the windshed / watershed of that lake at that point in time that you could probably date. But that is very poor spatial resolution. It's hard to ask questions about a small meadow within a large forest. So moving forward, what about phytoliths? The word nerds in the crowd may have immediately dissected that term into two terms. First of all, you have phyto, plant. Second, you have lith, rock. These are silica. They are made in many plants, not all plants, but grasses are prolific producers. They take up the silica, same stuff that's probably in your window panes and your face of your glass and your pint glasses and so forth. And then they put it in their cells, between their cells, and this stuff is pretty neat. It can persist in the soil if it's not too acidic for tens of thousands of years. And if the soil keeps piling up, then you have a paleoecological proxy with a horizontal error of meters, maybe, unless the soil is really like rolling downhill, and that might inflate that a little bit. But they're tiny. And I've chosen this picture to highlight that, you know, that 1 grain of table salt being nearly 10 times as large as the long axis of that phytolith. It would take a long time to pick all of those out of the soil one by one to get a look at the ecosystems of the past. But we've got some lab techniques for that. I'll tell you a little bit about that. So let's ask the phytoliths. How old are these small meadows in the Oregon Coast Range forests? Phytoliths have a somewhat of a history in the paleoecology of the region. This is also that ecosystem or ecoregion map from the EPA, but it is at one less fine level of resolution. There have been 3 studies, counting the work I've done, of phytoliths in investigating the grassland woodland dynamics of these coastal ranges in the Pacific Northwest. One took place on Tumbo Island in British Columbia. This was part of Jenny McCune's dissertation that's come out in some papers that she's published since then. I did a little bit of work at those 5 sites you saw earlier, just down the road from Nehalem. And then Renske Kirk-Holtes put out a study she did a little while back near Eugene, sort of around the corner of the Willamette Valley, but still looking at these grassland woodland edges and dynamics and so forth. How do you work with a phytolith? What does a phytolith look like in this case? Well, I want to introduce you to 2 phytoliths. First, what we'll call a stellate phytolith. It looks like a star or maybe a starfish, something like that. On the right is an old figure. You can see a Doug fir twig on the bottom left. If you take one leaf and sort of clear it, I don't know, maybe it was hydrogen peroxide or something, then you can see that those sclerid cells, which cross through and link together multiple sort of foliar parts of the needle or the leaf's anatomy, those are places where silica ends up deposited. And so they create these casts of these really wild shaped cells in the Doug fir leaf. And not many other plants, in fact, to my knowledge, no other plants make those stellate phytoliths. And so when you find something that looks like that in your soil, that means that a Doug fir leaf fell and decayed there and is therefore a very high fidelity representative for Doug fir forest at the time that soil was laid down. And they're relatively large, you know, 1 to 200 micrometers. Large, right? These things are still tiny, you still need a microscope. But comparatively, on the other side of the grassland woodland distinction, we have here some Rondelle phytoliths from short cells in grasses. And you see a Rondelle phytolith, it almost certainly came from something in the grass family. Many grasses make rondelles though, and it's hard to get more specific than grasses. Fortunately, a grass is very different from a tree. And so if you see a stellate phytolith in soil, that soil was probably laid down under a forest. And if you see a Rondelle phytolith in soil, that soil was probably laid down under a grassland. And those phytolith morphotypes, we call them, the types of shapes, those were found in my study region, looking pretty much the same as those same morphotypes found in these other study regions. And I did some other work. I'm not going to bore you with the figures to check my assumption that the soil was building over time. You know, the organic matter tapers off monotonically as you go down the soil profile. And I sent in some charcoal to be carbon dated for an exorbitant amount of Dartmouth's money. And we found that the date range represented by the data I'm about to show you is on the order of centuries to millennia. So from over 100 years to, in one case, over 4,000 years, depending on the rate of soil building at these different sites. And I also sampled in these 5 meadows and then did some work to find nearby forest sites, which would be within the same 5-kilometer radius, that probably the same ungulates are exerting whatever top-down pressure they do on both places. And they have similar and topographic conditions. And I used some accent habitat suitability modeling to line up places for that reason. But so just so you know, these are comparable forests and meadows. How do you get these phytoliths out? Let's just breeze through it. You dig a little hole, and then you take cake layer slices of the soil. And in my case, each one was 2 centimeters thick. You break up the large pieces, you run it through a sieve, because phytoliths are very small, you don't need those large pieces. And then they're still larger than clays, and so you shake it up with some water, let it sit. At a certain time point, a few hours in, all of the phytoliths have settled to the bottom, and many of the clays are still up in the water column. So you just pour that off, or decant it if you're a scientist, and start over until your water comes out pretty clear and you've gotten rid of the bulk of the clays. And then you burn out all the organics at a scorching hot temperature. I think it was over 500 Celsius in that muffle furnace. Not at that moment, not when I had my hands in there, but you get rid of all of it. You could clear some carbonates with some hydrogen peroxide at this point and things. But then the real money maker in this process, or the money taker, the stuff's expensive, is the heavy liquid. The goo in that tube, well, the liquid in that tube, it's no longer clay-bearing water. It's colored like that because it's sodium polytungstate. And it is almost 2.5 times as dense as water. So everything that is more dense than this liquid settles out to the bottom. But everything that is less dense than this liquid, such as phytoliths, and that's why we use a liquid of this particular density, floats up to that little scummy layer on the top. And you can see that you don't get very much out of each soil sample. You've reduced it quite a lot. You do another round of getting the clays out in a very small Q centrifuge. And then you mix that stuff up, taking very careful measurements with a very high power scale, mount it on your slide, stick that under the microscope, and there you go. You're looking at a lot of phytoliths under there. If you really squint, just to the right of center, you can see a 10 micron scale bar next to a little Rondelle phytolith in this particular screen grab. And so that's how you extract a phytolith from the soil. And that allows you to listen to the story the soil is trying to tell you as you look down that profile as a proxy for looking back in time. And what does it tell you? All right, kind of a complicated figure. Along the bottom axis, it's a log transformation of the ratio of stellates to rondelles. So to the left of the figure, you have more rondelles, therefore it's a more grassland, grassy dominated ecosystem. And to the right of the figure, you have more stellates, and so there are more Doug fir trees than grasses. And top to bottom, that's looking down the soil column. Each dot is the average of the 5 meadows or the 5 forests, with error from those means. And you can see that over time, forests are always forests. You know, those stellate phytoliths from Doug fir trees dominate all the time. And you can see that the meadows, at deeper depths, they look exactly like grasslands, and at shallower depths, they look in the sort of transition phase. But it's worth pointing out, and I can show you this figure if you really wanted, but the punchline would be that the grass phytoliths, the rondelles, are simply less dense at shallower depths in the soil. It's not that there are more trees, it's just that grasses are underrepresented in those meadows in shallow, therefore recent soil layers. And who knows, that could be because a bunch of forbs, you know, non-grass herbs, moved in and displaced some of the grasses that were making the rondelles. Could be a story of invasive species, or, you know, the movement of species around the world. Could be something else, could be an artifact of the data. But the take-home point here is that phytoliths, they're a good window into the past of these places, which are too small to be picked up by many other paleoecological methods, and which are below the scale of analysis in these really broad sort of biome models, which rely a lot on bottom-up controls. And in the Coast Range, we've found in some meadows and some nearby forests, those phytolith assemblages, you know, the collection of phytolith from each soil sample, they change over depth, and the depth is a good relative proxy for time. And then we found out, once we checked all those boxes, hey, the forests near the meadows under comparable conditions, they stay forested for hundreds to thousands of years into the past, while the meadows have remained non-forested and mostly grassy, perhaps even more so way back in time. So there's the past. There's the first half of the title of the talk. What about the present? And by the present of these meadows, I mean, what's going on? Ideally, these are going to be the things that have been going on the whole time to explain this long-term persistence, but you know, I couldn't do these observations and experiments retroactively, so I have to tell you what I found out now, or a few years ago now, and hope that that was true then as well. So we can break that question of what's going on into three questions. What steers these little old meadows away from becoming forest? What keeps them on a different train track? Number one, you know, is there anything we can look for in terms of a bottom-up control? Do soils differ between meadow and forest? Number two, anything we can look for a top-down control? You know, are the herbivores, the ungulates, the hooved herbivores, are they impacting woody understory plants in and around meadows? And then I did a little bit of an experiment to put them to the test. Do site properties, you know, meadow versus meadow versus meadow, or ungulate herbivores, or interactions between different kinds of plants, what's really affecting woody plant growth in these meadows? Question number one, is meadow soil different from forest soil? The answer simply is yes. There were some other metrics that they were not different, like every physical measure of the soil I was looking at. The metrics I chose, like the particle size distribution, weren't showing a difference, but chemically speaking, meadow soils are nutrient poor compared to forest soils. Maybe that's something about the speed at which the nutrients cycle. You know, there's a caveat to every one of these takeaway points, but if you wanted to tweet the punchline, the meadow soils are lower in carbon and lower in nitrogen than the forest soils. So maybe that gives us one leg of a stool to sit on to contemplate what's really going on here. So bottom-up controls, still on the table. What about top-down controls or browsers? I'm using browsers and herbivores and ungulates kind of interchangeably here. I just mean big furry things that eat the tops off of trees. Are they affecting woody seedlings? So here I laid down my trusty 1 meter quadrat along these long transects from the meadows into the forests and counted the woody plants, which were shorter than me, by species and whether they'd ever been visibly browsed. What did I find? Well, you can break those woody plants into shrubs and trees, and there were a lot more shrubs. What's going on with the shrubs? The top of this figure is how many shrub stems, or if it was a clonal shrub, root collars, how many were there per meter square? And along right to left, along that bottom axis, it's the distance away from the edge of the meadow. I did some real fancy GIS. Don't ask me too many questions about that, to calculate the actual straight line shortest distance from each quadrat along that line to the nearest, meadow edge from imagery. And I found that shrubs are the most dense in the forest right at the edge. And that was true. These are statistically significant trend lines from a somewhat complicated model. But shrubs they're clustered toward the edge. And in ecology, we call that the edge effect. The trees are probably making it easier for the shrubs to do their thing, but they don't extend out into the meadow. So they're not a leading edge of shrubification, which is another word for woody encroachment in the Arctic especially. So what we learn here, it's nice to know that it won't help us know what's going on in the Arctic. It's like Edison checking off another thing that does not work in a light bulb. And then inversely, in the bottom of this figure, the proportion of those seedlings which were browsed, and those dots are scaled by how many there were per quadrat. The proportion browsed was lowest right at the edge. So ungulates or somebody seems to be hammering shrubs in the forest and in the meadow, and maybe because it's so thick, they just can't get in there and eat the shrubs right at the edge of the meadow in the forest. So shrubs seem to be in this stationary band, like a little necklace around the meadows, not really moving in. And if they were to try to move in, you could imagine the belly of those curves being in the meadow means that maybe there's some top-down control keeping them out. But the shrubs aren't going to turn it into a forest. They might turn it into a little shrub field. I've heard somebody call them little brush holes or shrubby spots, shrub fields, which is great if you're out looking for salmonberry, for instance, but not if you're looking for a forest. So what about the trees? Well, there were only enough Doug fir trees, and that was the only species that was represented enough to do any tests anyway. There were only enough Doug fir trees at one meadow site on these transects for me to do some statistics. But the statistics are interesting, and I think they're very suggestive that in the meadow, especially toward the meadow interior, there was much more browse pressure on these Doug fir trees. And off in the forest, I found one unbrowsed Doug fir tree 40 meters out into the forest somewhere. But in general, at and away from the edge, there's not as much browse on the trees. Who knows, maybe the forest elk, once they get in the forest, they start looking for the shrubs. I can't talk to the elk to ask them, but this is tantalizingly suggestive evidence that there is some sort of top-down control going on trees in the meadows. So what's really going on? Let's put it to the test. I think there's a Disney song about putting it to the test. I forget. Maybe it's They Might Be Giants from their Here Comes Science album. So what's going on? Top-down control, bottom-up control, plant-plant interactions. I did a little experiment, planted a bunch of trees, little Doug fir plugs. And I did 4 things. We've got control seedlings. I just planted them, stick them and forget them. I did some clearing. Every plant within 1 meter of that planting was toast for a year, came back every few months and zapped them all with a weed whacker or my own 2 hands and some shears. I exclosed herbivores from some, and then some of them got the deluxe city, Emerald City Wizard of Oz treatment. They didn't have to deal with ungulates, and they didn't have to deal with competitors or allies, depending on how you feel about the plant-plant interactions. And I did that across all 5 meadows to get enough power to do some statistics. Actually planted twice as many trees as I ended up reporting on, but those I'm reporting on show us this kind of complicated figure. Let me walk you through it. Top panel A represents how many of the trees made it through the whole year alive. And you can see that, they all died at one site, of the ones which were not in cages, right? So that's what the filled versus unfilled distinction is, because according to the statistics, there was significant variation between sites, indicating there's something going on with abiotic bottom-up controls. But look down there at your annual growth. There's variation between sites, but in every case, the presence or access of herbivores, wouldn't you know, resulted in shorter trees compared to the ones that the herbivores couldn't get to, or at least had reduced access to. Sometimes they would screw around with my cages, but couldn't help them. They couldn't babysit them all day, you know. That's the price you pay for ecological data, is a little bit of fuzziness. So we can say that the growth of these Doug fir seedlings was limited by ungulates and that it varies by site. And so if you control for ungulates, if you run a model with just the ungulates and take the residual variance, hang with me for a second. What of the soil characteristics that I described earlier best explains that residual variance after you control for herbivory? The delta AIC off on the right is just a metric of how well that variable fits the data. And the null model there is just saying they all regress to the mean, there's no pattern. So the only soil characteristic that performed better than just the overall mean, the null model, was the total nitrogen in the soil. So once you account for herbivores, we have a leading contender for what it is about the soil that keeps the trees from growing in the meadows. And remember, nitrogen was lower in the meadows than in the forest. And you know, I can say all of these figures in this meadow present section, they're all out last fall in the Journal of Vegetation Science. So you can read a lot more in the discussion there about, and I'd be happy to send you the paper, just shoot me an email, go through Zach to get it if you need to. I'd be happy to say more about the ways in which nitrogen is tightly conserved in Oregon Coast Range forests, and it is often a limiting nutrient and there's not much deposition. Well, there's more now for human reasons, but I think Doug Glavich might talk to you more about that in the seminar series later this year with his lichen bioindicators speech. So I don't want to steal too much of his thunder, but why am I so hung up on the soils in these meadows? Well, look on the left here, those 3 green bars are all measures of how big your average meadow is in the Oregon Coast Range. The ones I studied, the ones from Zold's study in 2009, and all of those mapped by Doug Glavich in his big non-forest communities project that's been going on for a few years in the Coast Range, relatively small. On the left, that y-axis, it's on a log scale note. So like the Richter scale, small differences are very large. And then right next to it, how big is a standard patch of soil, an average patch of soil? This is from Surgo data. This is served by the federal government. And so it's easy for soil units to get lumped together, and the patches are probably smaller, probably match meadows better, versus ungulate home ranges, these 2 metrics of what's the home range of a black-tailed deer in the Oregon Coast Range and what's the home range of a Roosevelt elk in the Oregon Coast Range. Those are fairly recent data, and they're quite a bit bigger than soils, patch sizes, and ungulates can go outside of their home range too. And then fire, famously important as you could say a top-down control in ecosystems in the Oregon Coast Range, but they're just enormous. Burns like the Tillamook burn, huge, and it was hard for me to ask an experimental question anyway, because it's difficult to talk folks into letting you conduct a controlled burn in the middle of a timber unit in the Oregon Coast Range. So what's the takeaway point for meadows present? Herbivory by, hooved herbivores like ungulates, like elk and deer, and perhaps soil nitrogen. They comprise a top-down, bottom-up sort of pincher squeezing the trees out of these meadows, as far as I can tell. That's the best guess from the evidence that I've uncovered so far. And there's me, waist deep in one of those holes I was digging. And it's worth pointing out, you can see that screen in the background that I spent my time at Oregon State largely getting trained as an archaeologist, and was also looking for a human narrative in this story, a human thread to weave through this story. And that was kind of one of the fascinating things I found out in this study. No evidence of people, no homestead fields mapped onto these meadows, no artifacts or anthropogenic soils in these meadows. They seem to just be there for a long time because they are, not because we make them that way, which is exciting. We go back to all of these big ideas which intersect in these meadows and the Coast Range forests. But what do those big ideas mean to you? Well, it depends on how you identify and how you want to engage with these meadows. Maybe you're a hunter. I know there's lots of deer and elk in the meadows, and I've heard a lot of hunters in the Coast Range. You know, you hop over to Cascades or the east side because you can see better. It's hard to shoot a deer that you can't see. Well, if they're in the meadow, you can sure see them. But I imagine many of you are natural resource managers, or you have an affinity for natural resource management. And so why did I end up studying meadows? Not just because I'm fascinated with them, but because I was trying to find what are the levers you can pull and the right buttons you can push and the right things you consider when making decisions to make a meadow that is kind of like a self-cleaning oven or a short-haired dog, hypoallergenic. You know, it takes care of itself. It's like a, what's the Gen X metaphor? It's a latchkey meadow. Maybe a site that doesn't support trees because the soil nitrogen is not too good could be a good candidate for converting to an open space like a meadow. Maybe the top-down control is important to imitate aggressively, like with mowing or something, and staying on the cycle of mowing. You know, these are the kind of levers you can pull for maximal cost benefit in maintaining a meadow. Maybe you are an amateur naturalist or a professional naturalist. If you are, good for you. But I worked on a little pun that no one's going to get reading the non-forested landscape. There's a phenomenal book called Reading the Forested Landscape by Tom Wessels. Talks about forests up in the Northeast where I was sitting my butt while I was doing a lot of the statistics here. But perhaps what you've seen in this talk will empower you to read the non-forested landscape a little more fluently. And as you're walking through the meadows, you can link them to these global phenomena, these patterns of woody encroachment, of temperate montane meadows, wondering about the climate herbivore hypothesis, or the ancient battle between grasslands and woodlands, as the ecologists might say. Speaking of the ecologists, there's a lot to learn from these meadows in terms of small-scale processes, controls on woody encroachment, you know, this pressing question of the present. And I think that there's a lot to learn from them as small natural features, disproportionately enriching the landscapes that they grace. So I hope you've enjoyed this small tour through the what, the how, the why of these small meadows in the Oregon Coast Range. I want to real quickly acknowledge a bunch of folks. You know, what's the saying? If you see a turtle on a fence post, you know it had help. So a bunch of folks at Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, a bunch of folks at the Forest Service, colleagues at Dartmouth, colleagues outside of Dartmouth. You know, my parents and my wife have all helped me bring this to you, and so I thought I would recognize them as well. And I hope I came in right on time, shooting for 45 minutes. And so that's all I have, and I'm open to questions from the crowd.
So we've got a couple questions here in the chat.
I see that. I could just read down them.
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, so we've got, what is the name of that book? That was at 7:27 p.m. Which book was I talking about? I don't know if Barbara is still on the call and wants to clarify that.
It was about maps.
Oh, right. It's called Chaining Oregon. I've got a copy on my bookshelf somewhere. So yeah.
What's that word, chaining?
Chaining, like the survey chains. It is by Kay Atwood, and it was published in copyright 2008 by the MacDonald and Woodward Publishing Company. The full title is Chaining Oregon, Surveying the Public Lands of the Pacific Northwest, 1851 to 1855. Oh, good question, Tom. I'm just gonna go straight to Tom's question. What's the time scale on the meadow to transition change on the graph. It's a tricky question because the carbon dates we got from those charcoals were so widely divergent. Some meadows that vertical distance from 0 to 14 centimeters depth in mineral soil represented like 120 years. And I think in one case it represented something like 2,000 years. So in each case, it's safe to assume that soil is more or less building over time, but the time scale of the change from what looks like very grassy to what looks like somewhat mixed is on the order of centuries to millennia, but not a clean distinction that applies to all the meadows at once. I hope that answers your question. Great, thank you, Tom. Joyce, I see that you brought up the GLO maps. Is there, are you bringing that to the group as a cool thing? Because it's a really cool thing. Or...
Oh, no. I was just trying to help you remember the question about which book.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah, sure.
I can use all the help I can get. Yeah, the GLO maps, what does it stand for? The General Land Office? This was
yeah, General Land Office. Yeah, they're a really valuable tool. I was curious though, I'm wondering if you had considered any of the Coast Range meadows that are more obviously connected with as anthropogenic landscapes. Like I'm thinking in particular of, like, for example, Cascade Head.
I've been to them and I've thought a lot about them and I love them. And during the course of my PhD, spent a lot of time making rules for myself in my research that cut places out of the sample more than included them in the sample, because you've got what's interesting and what you can ask answerable questions about, what you can afford to tackle, and then like what actually gets written into the dissertation. So the short answer is that what I've said here, it was not meant to apply to more clearly anthropogenic meadows. And I think that it's worth pointing out that I characterized fire as a natural and therefore not anthropogenic, even though it's, that distinction is hard to defend. Force and a fire on the small scale is much more important in these places that have a long-standing relationship with the folks that have been burning in them and doing other things, digging in them. I know that you've spent a lot of time researching on that, and I know that there are some other folks. Chris Adlam down at Berkeley was looking at a lot of the non-fire, so largely digging anthropogenic drivers of ecological community in that way. I hope I've taken a good stab at your question there.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, you finished your dissertation in a reasonable period of time, and so now you can move on to other questions, perhaps.
Yeah, bigger, maybe, or different, and also interesting questions. Best dissertation's a done dissertation. I'm going to go to Stuart. What is a good way to add into meadows? How much and how often? Well, let me preface that by saying that if it's a meadow and you want it to turn into forest, it seems like in addition is a good way to do that, because if meadows are poor in nitrogen, and maybe that's related to why they are meadows instead of forests, then adding nitrogen to the meadow would potentially put it on that ecological railroad track toward forest rather than remaining meadow. But nitrogen is a pretty widely available fertilizer. Every fertilizer that you see at a big box home store is probably going to have an NPK set of numbers on it. And so those are the 3 macronutrients that most plants need. And the N stands for nitrogen. So if you look for a high nitrogen fertilizer, it's always going to be the first number out of those 3, like a 1000 or something. And it might have a name like nitrate or ammonia or ammonium, these mineral versions of nitrogen. In terms of how much and how often, I don't know, that depends on what kind of ecological change you want to get. If you want to turn it into a forest, a lot of it is going to run off, a lot of it's going to leach out. Don't put in so much that it leads to like an algal bloom or a rock snot outbreak in your downriver aquatic environment. But it's hard to say that you could poison the land with too much nitrogen. It'll probably get taken up somewhere.
If I can chain off of that question for a second, because I was thinking about how you were looking for evidence of dug fir or of grasses in your meadow samples. And it strikes me that if nitrogen is one of the limiting factors in conversion to forest, then alders are kind of uniquely suited for converting those meadows into forests. And I'm wondering what's keeping the alders out of those environments, because they love a disturbance.
They do. Let's write a grant, Zach. Let's figure this out, because alders, I don't think they make phytoliths, and I don't think we can look back in time and ask that question of what are the alders doing, mediating this tension between the dug firs and the grasses or the graminoids in these meadows over time.
That sounds great. Let's hustle that money.
Yeah. Sticking with nitrogen, Alan had a question about if there's a hypothesis on why these areas are nitrogen poor. I don't know. A hypothesis is a pretty stringent word. I might have more like a conjecture or two on why these areas are nitrogen poor. Looking at the landforms on some of these meadows, they look a little bit to me like they could be the rubble pile at the bottom of old landslide action. And that might explain why I was encountering poorly sorted gravels and cobbles a lot. Like I never really hit bedrock as I was digging these holes. And I gave you data for down to 50 centimeters on the soil, but I dug some of those holes more than a meter deep, which if you're digging a cylindrical hole 40 centimeters wide, that's why I could stand in one and you don't see the other half of my body. And I never really hit bedrock. And the Oregon Coast Range is a very alive geographic area, young, movement-prone landscape. And I'm sure that you're all waiting for that big one, that big quake. And a lot of times you're gonna be driving to the field site and there's another landslide, you gotta figure out another way. There's no cell service. I'm just listening to the crappy staticky Portland pop hits station wandering through the logging road, see if I can get to the meadow again or lose the trees forever. Sorry, that was a tangent, but the meadows might be nitrogen poor if conjecturally, all of these little particles got mobilized in a landslide, and then all of the small ones that might have nitrogen-bearing compounds accreted to, clays and silts and small particles, maybe they get washed away, maybe they're not hung up in these clod head kind of conglomerates in the soil matrix. They get tumbled around, they get shuffled, and now you've got this whole slide scar funneling water down into the rubble pile. And it seems like a plausible way in which nutrients could be stripped out of soil, which might have been forest soil up to that point until it got relocated downslope and then kind of leached through, sort of like running your water through the grounds of your coffee until there's nothing left there. More nitrogen. What about converting forests to meadow? Are there ways to reduce nitrogen over time? Oh yeah, you're welcome, Alan. No worries. Hi, I'm here. So Tom, one way to convert a forest to a meadow would be to cut down the trees, but it's not going to take care of itself very well. And I've seen that happen in some places in the Coast Range. The trees often will grow back, and I'm sure that's, if you're asking that question, that's a phenomenon that you've observed and perhaps fought against. And so how do you reduce nitrogen over time? It's a good question. I guess you want to keep out the nitrogen fixers. Seems like you could keep it from being added. You could maybe find plants that are taking up the nitrogen and then harvest them for some other reason, sort of get the plants to, because plants, you can think of them as miners. They've got all those roots, and they're drinking the sunshine and the water and the air, but they're also grabbing all of their little micronutrients from the soil. And so if they do the digging for you, and with the help of the bacteria, they get the nitrogen into their own biomass. So maybe, I don't know what species would be interesting, but if you're looking maybe for a non-timber forest product kind of plant that you would maybe have a use for, even you turn the nitrogen in the soil into usable biomass for some other purpose for you, could sort of connect the dots in a miniature permaculture style loop. I'm afraid I don't have many other tractable recommendations. I don't know of something that you can just pour on the soil that's going to bind up or get rid of the nitrogen, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know. So on the rag, is temperature a driving factor of nutrient poor soils? For instance, a 10 times reduction of bacterial activity per decrease of 10 degrees Celsius could be, but the mismatch for me there is that meadow soil is very exposed. The grasses, they're not much of a canopy layer in terms of intercepting solar energy, versus trees are very good at intercepting solar energy. You in the winter in snowy areas, once you get a little snow in the branches, it can be 20, 30 degrees warmer in the understory. And so that's where you'll find the deer, as opposed to out in fields and other open areas, because there's just no thermal regulation. And so if the nutrient poor soils in this case are in the more exposed and therefore more solar radiation areas, then it seems like the bacteria would be going faster in the meadows. And so if the bacteria are involved in nitrogen fixation, then the arrows are pointing the wrong way. If these are decomposers, if instead the microbial activity that's being galvanized by these more amenable higher temperatures are activities that would move the nutrients around and make them unavailable to trees, that's a different story. Phytoliths are easy to work with because they might be small, but they can't move on their own. And so you can isolate them out of the soil. But figuring out which little microscopic critters are in your soil is, we have these scattershot methods of sequencing batch DNA from soils, but it's hard to even pin down which taxa are represented with these DNA that we're batching out of the soils. And so hard to say. Greg, Florida mangrove reek when exposed by low tides, but Oregon bays don't. Oh, what do they smell like? I assume decomposition, right?
Sulfur.
Sulfur. Huh. What do you think that's coming from?
From all the sulfur reducing bacteria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine
They're
that the water is a little
basically
warmer.
decomposing, shit.
Yeah, that's what they're there for. I can't do that on my own either.
No. But, that's all governed by temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Simple reaction kinetics.
Yeah, you could say that it's a bottom-up control on a bottom-up control in that case. You've got the kinetics of the system driving the sort of nutrient conditions that the plants are making do with.
Right. I just say because I live 50 yards from Nehalem Bay.
Uh-huh.
And when the tide pulls all the way out, it doesn't smell bad.
That's great.
I also live by Florida
Florida
mangroves from the same distance.
Mm-hmm.
Their tide pulled back. It smelled awful. The whole town stunk like Tillamook. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was that kind of day and night situation.
Mm-hmm. I believe you.
Which I think was just turnover. Like sulfur reducing bacteria as a result of biological turnover produce sulfur dioxide. And it's and you can't help but notice it. So
No, it's pretty invasive in your nostrils.
Since
Do you
moving
mean
here from the
turnover in
south,
terms of the bacteria themselves or the plant which produces the plant matter that they're working on?
oh, I think it might be the whole thing. Or
Mhm.
get more recalcitrant, not recalcitrant, but you might have more plants that settle to the bottom without being digested, that become oil or natural
Mhm.
gas or something.
Mhm.
Bacteria don't eat them as soon as they're deposited. And by definition, that's a gas deposit.
Mhm. I think it's safe to say up in the forests, and I think also in the meadows, that the nutrient cycles are going fast enough that not much slips through the cracks and ends up in those anaerobic depositional environments, especially in terms of the nitrogen. I mean, there's this guy, Stephen Parakis with the USGS in Corvallis, and he's been publishing on this for a decade or two, about like the nitrogen cycle being tied to the calcium cycle in the Coast Range, and how nitrogen, everybody needs it, and only the bacteria can get it out of that triple bonded into in the air. So,
Well, I think that agrees with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They simply don't have the magnitude of productivity to generate a good stink.
Mm-hmm.
High latitude mudflats that you get with low latitude mudflats.
Mm-hmm.
Be a real simple, heuristic or rule of thumb.
Mm-hmm. I want to make a comparison there to latitudinal gradients, because we talk about temperate versus tropical, equatorial ecosystems. And as you move south through, say, Florida and the mangroves, you get to more mangroves across the isthmus between the Americas. But if you end up like in Chile, sticking with the Pacific coast, then the Valdivian coast range, you get really similar forests and forest conditions to the Oregon Coast Range. There's this sort of ecological analog. I think somebody named Albeck published out in the early 90s, which is a fascinating read. And so you can see those gradients of latitude corresponding with the amount of solar radiation you get, the amount of energy that is incoming for these microbes to speed up and work with. And then that
So
time in the
that's
production.
almost a Jared Diamond Guns, Germs, and Steel analog to the
that was a well-written
versus
book.
north-south orientation of land masses. And
yeah, that's an interesting thesis. These, like I was saying with that question of scale, when you're making a very broad conjecture like that, it's there's a lot of evidence to sift through, so you can find the evidence you need or not, or it's an interesting thing to think about for sure.
right, well,
Asia being east-west,
my
America.
thought is, why aren't there any bugs in the Pacific Northwest?
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, moving here to the Pacific Northwest and hiking a lot, one of the first things I noticed that there's hardly any insect life here that I can see. You go hiking in Florida and you can't help but run into insects. They'll find you before you ever find them. I don't know how many crab spiders I've pulled out of my hair, but you don't have that kind of reckless head-on collision with insects in the Pacific Northwest.
Right, you've got like your
To believe that there's something missing in the nutrient cycle here, and
yeah, or maybe different adaptations to whatever the layout of the resources is. That's a good line of inquiry to go down. I'm afraid I don't have much to say on the bugs, though.
okay, just curious.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Greg. I think I might move on to Stuart's question here. Also
Thank
about,
you.
yeah, my pleasure, Greg. Stuart was wondering, could low retained soil moisture have an impact on keeping meadows and discouraging trees? You know, cobble and gravel drains quickly and less biomass to decay and hold moisture than a forest. I think that's a great speculation, Stuart. And I was looking at plant available water as a function of the soil texture, because I was hoping to find evidence of that. And when I'm just comparing head to head, the soil nitrogen was a better fit for the variation in Doug fir seedling growth, not explained by herbivory. But that's not a definitive answer to the question. It just means that the arrow points more in the direction of nutrients than it does of water holding physics, given a very limited set of evidence. So I don't want to cross it off the list because I like the idea too. It's very plausible. You know, I also think that some of the best scientific questions are questions with multiple different answers, each of which a reasonable person might advocate for or find plausible. So Stuart, let's investigate it if you want.
Sounds good.
Great. Hit me up. Oh yeah, Zach caught a question from Naomi B. How many sample locations for the phytoliths in each meadow, and how are they placed? Just one per meadow, because it was such a labor-intensive process, and I wanted to be able to directly compare phytoliths from one layer of the soil with the layers in the same location on the map, sitting above and below it. So in each meadow, there's one sample location for phytoliths, and then near each meadow, there's one sample location in the forest for phytoliths. And so each depth more or less represents 10 samples, 5 each from one meadow and 5 each from one forest in terms of a methodological thing. And I wish the study were more robust. It's something that I ended up doing on my own. And so you can only listen to so much Pandora. And I was sort of borrowing time on the geology department's fancy microscope right up until somebody's TV fell on it. That, you know, the joys of grad school. But I hope that answers Naomi's question.
Does anybody else have any questions to add in?
Brandon, this is Tom, and I'm working with some landowners by Cannon Beach who are interested in converting some forest into meadow, which is why I asked the questions I did. Mm-hmm. And so I'd love to keep this discussion open with you and you know, think about ways that might work. You know, recognizing, like you said, that it's probably, especially, you know, at the beginning, going to be more of a fight against, you know, encroaching vegetation. But the questions about soils and why and how we might change those soils over time to get more persistent meadow habitat are the kind of things that these landowners would be willing and interested in exploring. So I'd love to get your contact. I see your email here. I'll write that down and I'll send you an email.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about that, Tom. I know that there might be some cost to it, but I imagine that these landowners have a few candidate locations for these meadows. And so it seems like one useful thing to know is what are the soil conditions in those candidate locations already? Like where might you expect a greater chance of success, or where might conditions be more meadowy already, especially if they have a meadow nearby. You know, my study sites weren't super close to Cannon Beach. It's kind of in the other direction. So it would be interesting to compare maybe the nearest meadow as a role model for what they're interested in to the conditions that they have on their property, and see if that could maybe narrow down or make a set of deliverables for what's the biggest difference, what's the first lever to pull, maybe.
Yeah, and you know, I think the nearest meadows are really coast, those seaside meadows, which I'm gathering from your presentation are probably a different animal than what you're talking about today, which are more balds and other sort of higher elevation meadows. But their property is, while it's near the coast, it's a little bit higher in elevation, but it's kind of in that middle elevation between.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I don't think they've really had the exploration of the soil conditions, and I think that's a good place to start. But we can continue that discussion on email. The talk was really interesting, and I appreciate your time, Braden.
Thanks, Tom. I'm looking forward to corresponding about it. Love talking about meadows.
Yeah.
Well, I think that makes for a pretty solid wrapping up point. I'm going to stop the recording here, but before I do, thank you again so much. This was actually a wonderful talk, and I'm thrilled we finally got you up here to do
Just
it.
happy to be here.
Yeah, let's make a time to do some mushroom picking in person instead next time.
Yeah. Oh, that book I recommended to you, I could recommend it to the whole crowd here. If you haven't read it, it's called The Mushroom at the End of the World, which is a fascinating exploration of, you know, late stage capitalism and globalization and friction between species. But it centers in part on mushrooms in Burns in Oregon, and, you know, people coming in from all over the world picking them, and the ways in which they're enmeshed in these global, you know, part of reading the non-forested landscape, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what you're looking at, but I don't know what I'm looking at in terms of mushrooms. So I'm really looking forward to you helping me out with that part.
Always a pleasure. Well, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming. As always, if you have questions about the presentation or are interested in communicating with either myself or with Braden, feel free to reach out. And this recording will be up on YouTube for you to watch in the future.